When Yankee and Alan asked me to make a short speech, I was delighted to accept. And I'm not going to speak for a great length of time, but as you know, this exhibition celebrates 50 years of Golden Lane. And it also celebrates the work of the Practice Chamberlain, Powell and Bon. I joined CPB, as we called it, in 1958, a half century ago. That's why I've got grey hair. A year before that, I think it was a year before that, I was privileged to hear Corb give a talk at the School of Architecture in Cambridge, which I thought was quite an interesting linkage with what's happening today and what's happening over there in the Barbican. It was a great privilege for me to work with Geoffrey Powell, as he liked to call himself, not Powell, is that right? Yeah, Powell. So everybody says Powell, but it's actually Powell. But I worked with Geoffrey for 3 decades until he retired. I also worked with Christophe Bon for the same period until he retired, and I worked for Joe Chamberlain for about 23 or 4 years until he died. He didn't die because of me. But for me, it was a wonderful, formative 30 years of my life, and I spent all of that time with the practice and then took it over, and it became Chamberlain, Powell and Bon and Woods when they retired. I actually worked on this building, I discovered, looking back through some notes, but I only worked on it for 2 weeks. And I remember during that 2 weeks there was an enormous crisis about the building, because the highways engineer suddenly came through and spoke to Geoffrey and Joe and said, there's a problem with this building on Goswell Lane. It's projecting too far over the road, and the double-decker buses are going to hit themselves on the building. And there was can't you imagine, this is a British problem. There's an enormous debate going backwards and forwards about it, and until literally and laterally the solution was found quite quickly, when it was decided, I think it was at Joe's suggestion, that they should move Goswell Road slightly. Which they did. So it's literally and laterally that it happened. Now, because of tonight, I've been checking through some papers I've kept, and it's wonderful to see some of the papers that Polly has found here, the early drawings, which are great to see in colour. But I came across a couple of very interesting papers, one by Geoffrey and the other by Peter Chamberlain, who was called Joe, which I thought were very informative, and with your permission I'd just like to read a little bit from them. I don't normally like reading speeches. I think it's the most boring way to give a speech, but because it's somebody else's words, I think I can be excused. The first one is that Joe Chamberlain wrote. It's part of a lecture he gave at the RIBA, and he wrote it in 1969, and I think he must have given it in that year, but I haven't had a chance to check it. And what he says was as follows. My partners and I were all teaching when we decided to go in for the Golden Lane housing competition in 1952. They're on the wall here. Partly because we had more energy than conviction in those days, and partly because it seemed wise to back the field each way, we decided to submit 3 deliberately different solutions to the problem as set out in the competition conditions. Geoffrey won, and we innocently thought we could forthwith settle down to the detailed process of detailing so-called working drawings. However, the blessings of an assessor and a client are of course insufficient by themselves, and it took some time to get planning approval from the LCC, that's pre-GLC. In those days, Arthur Ling was the principal planning officer, and he had rather different ideas from ourselves about the grouping of buildings, and indeed about their form, which he used to express by wrenching our study models apart and rearranging the buildings in a way more to his liking and less to ours. The whole thing was like a cross between a planning school seminar and a somewhat tense nursery. Eventually we got wise to what was going on and brought the process to an end by screwing the buildings firmly to the legs, thus saying, both literally and metaphorically, this is our planning application. He got the message, we got town planning approval, and gradually the scheme got built. it's interesting, let me just interject there, that the scheme did not include this building for the competition. That came later. And he goes on to say, later on 2 more acres were added to the site, but by then the main development was already being built, and we had to contrive the extension with the high density of 200 persons per acre on this long, narrow site, which couldn't take any more high buildings. It was perhaps this which encouraged us to explore further high-density development within low buildings, this extension, Golden Lane, being limited for the most part to 4 stories. And then he goes on a bit later in his talk, before leaving Golden Lane, it's worth referring to one of our other competition submissions, and that's here on the wall here, which was an exercise in what he called the courthouse theme. 1.5 stories above ground level, laid out with small courts, private to each dwelling, and the public approach via other small courts, providing a main frontage to a group of 4 buildings. The concept behind this was to provide inward-looking privacy for family life. A density of 140 people to the acre was achieved. I think this is, I just want to interject here before I go on to say what Geoffrey was saying. I think this is an interesting alternative scheme to look at, because if you look at the first scheme that was produced for the Barbican, it also included low-rise courtyard housing. Christoph Bonn was a great fan of a German architect called Hilbersheimer, who produced quite a number of schemes for courtyard housing, and there's an excellent pamphlet that the AA produced on courtyard housing which shows these plans. Hilbersheimer later went to the States and worked with Mies on housing over there. But it is interesting that the courtyard housing solution was tried in the Barbican and wasn't liked by the corporation, and the practice also used it quite considerably in a scheme they did for a West London development which never got built, but which was published in the Architecture and Building News, called Boston Manor, and it's worth having a look at that if you're interested in courtyard housing. And then the last thing I'd just like to quote was from Geoffrey, who wrote a letter to a student who was doing a thesis or an exercise, a project at school on the Barbican, and he wrote as follows. To get approval for the loan sanction from the ministry, we had a series of meetings to discuss layouts of flats, etc. At one meeting, we 3 partners with the clerk to the corporation's Public Health Committee, the corporation didn't have much experience of housing and didn't have a housing committee, and we were discussing the extension of the scheme to Goswell Road, that's here, when we were joined by a senior civil servant. He put his hand on the map on the table over the Golden Lane area and swept it south towards St. Paul's, saying, "The minister would like to see housing in this area," unquote. I think the minister actually was Duncan Sandys. The remark seems almost casual, Geoffrey went on, but of course it sounded like a trumpet call to us, as no doubt intended. The area he indicated was roughly the western half of what is now the Barbican. It's fitting, I think, that Geoffrey should have linked the Golden Lane with the Barbican, because, of course, the Golden Lane is the progenitor of what's happening over there. They say, don't they, that great oaks from little acorns grow, but this is not a little acorn, it's a great scheme. Thank you.
I'd just like to round up this part of the proceedings by first of all congratulating the architects, because 50 years on, many of the people here are residents. Many of us are living in an estate which is absolutely superb. It's beautifully conceived, incredibly well detailed, but has worked for the past 50 years and is really a really great place in which to live, and I think is a model for a lot of, hopefully a model for a lot of current public housing. One thing I'd like to draw your attention to is the fact that this estate has a swimming pool, which is still lit just over my shoulder. It's incredibly unusual for public housing schemes to have a swimming pool at their heart, and it'd be very interesting to know exactly who suggested it, whether it came from the architects or from the City of London Corporation. But whatever the history of it, at the very heart of this estate is a swimming pool, a leisure centre, tennis courts, and a large number of social activities. And this is, I think, an astonishing way of creating housing, and it's continued to work, and I go swimming there as often as I can, and it's brilliant. So I wanted to really highlight that. I also wanted to say that we are at a very interesting point in the history of Golden Lane Estate. As you know, it became listed a couple of years ago, and just about a year ago, the landlords, the City of London Corporation, commissioned management guidelines with English Heritage, which means any changes to the estate have to be agreed by the planning authority, and so a lot of care will now go into preserving and maintaining the estate. However, there's a very interesting point in the history of the estate. The swimming pool is now 40 or 50 years old and is in a very poor state of repair, and this has been acknowledged by the City of London, who have commissioned a feasibility study, but it's a study that investigates either spending £2 million or £500,000 or closing it down. So there's a very particular issue about the welfare of the swimming pool, and there's a bit on the wall that you might want to read and comment on. Interestingly, there's already been mention of the Corbusier exhibition, which opened at the Barbican yesterday. The influence of Corbusier on this estate is undoubtedly very great, not least in the decision to build a roof garden. The roof garden is undoubtedly one of the most astonishing public spaces in London, but has not been open to anyone, either residents or the public, for 20 years, and in an incredibly densely populated part of the city where there is a commitment to good public space. I think there's a very interesting debate about how you gain access to it, how you maintain it. There are lots of complicated health and safety issues, but there's a debate worth having. And also, a lot of the estate, particularly the Great Arthur House, which had one of the first curtain walls in a housing estate, I think in the UK, is also in very poor condition. And again, there is a very interesting debate about how do you maintain it, how do you repair it, how do you fit in with English Heritage's guidelines, and how do you avoid bankrupting the people who will end up having possibly to pay for it. So what we've got here is a series of problems which face a lot of other listed housing estates. It's been the case in Spa Green Estate in Islington and a lot of other estates. But you've got here a hugely successful estate. You've got here an estate that has been listed, that is well photographed, that is much loved by its residents, but where the future is also very precarious. So I think it continues to be an estate that will provoke debate with residents, with architects, and with others. And I hope very much that as the organisers of this exhibition have said, this is the beginning of a debate. And I think the debate about how we live in it, as well as how we maintain and develop it, is one that we need to have over the next 3 years. Thank you.